Deakin University would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of all the unceded lands, skies, and waterways on which our students and staff come together. As we learn, teach, innovate, and research through virtually and physically constructed places across time, we pay our deep respect to the elders and ancestors who have cared for the country that you join us from, an ancient place where education, innovation, and knowledge transfer have taken place for many thousands of years. At Deakin, we aim to nurture and continue this important legacy whilst encouraging our communities to walk softly on country in the spirit of sustainability. In particular, we give gratitude to the elders and ancestors of Wadawurrung country, Wurundjeri country, and Eastern Maar country and beyond, where our physical campuses are located. Their contributions to our learning communities and environments are rich and highly valued. Deakin is committed to embedding Indigenous knowledges and perspectives in all disciplines that we teach, as well as advancing the self-determined interests of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, including treaty and truth-telling. As you move around our physical and virtual environments, take a moment to consider, appreciate, and listen deeply to the country beneath your feet.
Hello, Manea here, and welcome to the start of the 2023 Student Voice Symposium. I would like to acknowledge the contribution and support of the Australian Council for Student Voice, ACSV, Australian Association for Research and Education, AARE, and the Centre of Research for Educational Impact, REDI, at Deakin University. Now, in discussion with children, students and peers, whether in their past conferences, networking events at school, or just plain old catching up, one theme that often cropped up was student voice and its link to the curriculum, which also crossed over into discussions around pedagogy. So the planning committee decided to use this as the theme for each day of this particular symposium. Today, we delve into the history of student voice in Australia and how students currently active in this space are involved in student voice initiatives at school and in what ways. If we're lucky, they might share some insights into how this involvement has shaped their views and has impacted their lives. We hope that today's session will be used as a platform to motivate or inspire you as we move into the start of the new school year. Just to let you know that the chat function is enabled during this webinar, so please feel free to say hello and connect with others. In addition, if you would like to ask any questions directly to a member of the panel, or the panel in general, please use the Q&A function. With that in mind, let's start this webinar. Enjoy.
All right, g'day everyone. My name's Adam and I'll be the facilitator today. So I'm coming at you from Wurundjeri Wullen country today, just along the Merry Creek in Naarm or Melbourne. I'm currently a teacher on long service leave and a lecturer at Melbourne Uni, using the time to finish off my doctorate on the relationship between student agency and citizenship education. So I'm not in the classroom this year, but I hope you won't hold it against me. Today, we're really lucky to have with us Lynn, Jade, Sienna, and Roger to be talking about the history of student voice, but also really the current place of student voice as well. I think we'll actually just more or less get straight into it. So I might first ask Sienna, as you're the current student on this panel, if you maybe just want to introduce yourself and also share your recent work in relation to student voice.
Amazing. Thank you so much. So thank you everyone for joining us today. I am so excited to be here. As Adam mentioned, I'm a current student. So I'm in Southwest Victoria, which is a regional area. So I'm classed as a regional student. And for the past 3 years, I've been a member of the Student Executive Advisory Committee for the Student Victorian Representative Council. And I also do a lot of partnering work with YACVIC, which is a Youth Affairs Council of Victoria, and similar organisations as well. Something I'm super passionate about is mental health, education, consent education, and obviously student voice, and the way student voice impacts all of those different sectors. So at the moment, a passion project of mine is something I'm working on through VicSRC, and that's implementing a student-led mental health task force within the Victorian education system.
Thanks, Sienna. And so both Jade and Lynn are recent graduates just from last year. But Jade, if you want to fill us in on what you've been up to.
Yep. So my name's Jade. Obviously, I use she, her pronouns. And yeah, so I graduated last year and I'm just moved to Canberra. I'm at ANU at the moment. And yeah, something that I was working on last year, I wrote a thesis for one of my classes and did like a research project as well on the relationship between student voice and kind of going into informal and formal types of student voice and how that correlates to student activism within social movements. That's kind of where I'm at the moment. But yeah, I was involved with VicSRC for a long time and I was on the exec with Sienna a few years ago and Lynn as well.
Great, thanks, Jade. And then Lynn, in full disclosure, once upon a time I did teach Lynn, but haven't for a few years now. But yeah, Lynn, do you want to fill us in?
Hi everyone, I'm Lynn and I'm also a recent high school graduate and former VicSRC exec member where I worked very heavily in the consent education and mental health space. And at the moment, I'm also currently leading the development of a publication centering on student voice and agency to really continue with also Roger's Connect magazine legacy.
Thanks, Lynn. Now, just before I move to you, Roger, I just wanted to say it's nice to see so many familiar names in the attendees here, but even more exciting to see strangers. But in the spirit of student voice and dialogue, in any case, there is a Q&A open for this session. So by all means, while the session is going, feel free to write any questions that you have in that Q&A, and Mitch and I will make sure that we get to it. There's also the possibility of upvotes in the Q&A. So if you do like someone else's question, do feel free to give it a bit of a boost. Yeah, so we're really lucky now. We're going to hear from Roger on sort of how we got here and the history of student voice, and probably particularly student voice in Australia, and then broaden out from that. So Lynn, Jade and Sienna will be sharing where we're at now, and then really evolving into an ongoing discussion and seeing where we're going. So as much as possible, make sure you're contributing to that in the Q&A. But yeah, Roger, if you, I guess as well, maybe just want to fill people in on who you are for those who don't know you, and by all means let us know how we got here. Oh, you're on mute. Who had that on the bingo card?
Yeah, there we go. You said modern technology. Oh, all of these things. I remember when we talked to each other. Yeah, we can go way back with this. So my background is that as a secondary school teacher, taught maths and physics and things like that for many years. I got more interested in the 70s to teaching students than teaching physics. I began a series of really different curriculum projects. So my introduction to this work wasn't through governance issues or advocacy issues, but through curriculum-based issues in my classroom and things like that. And I'll talk about that in a second. I went from there to found Lionel Hall Community School here in Melbourne, and then burnt out from that, worked in the bureaucracy for a while in a program called Participation and Equity Program in the early 80s. Worked through that for a while, went off doing some independent consulting work, worked at Melbourne University and the Youth Research Centre, retired in 2004 and failed. And I'm now actually starting to succeed at that at last. And from 79 onwards, I started putting out a small magazine called Connect to share positive, practical stories about what people were doing, initially about what I was doing, but then other people started contributing to it. And that finished after 42 years and 250 issues at the end of year before last. And Lynn has made the courageous, somewhat, might say, decision to try and get something similar going, perhaps in a new form and things. So watch for developments on that. please do try and curtail me because I've got about 3 hours of things I could say, so I'll try not to. For me, as I said, the beginning of those issues about student voice, student agency and student participation started in the 70s for me, but it was already, as Jade has pointed out, grounded in work around informal student voice, the relationships that I had with students and things like that. And the fact that when I was teaching at Princess Hill, even before we started anything like this, we ran a coaching program at which we took students after and gave them free coaching in maths and science, and they taught me to swear in Greek and things like that. So there was a good relationship between that of give and take at that stage. And also at that stage, you became aware that there was quite an upsurge of activity coming out of activism against Australia's involvement in the war in Vietnam and against conscription and so on. And the development of technology such as Roneo machines and offset printing and so on meant that students could start producing stuff. And so I've got a whole drawer full of underground newspapers that students started producing in the school as their statement about agency. And some of them commenting about life in general and some of it about stuff in schools and things like that. So I started doing that. The first thing that I started was a cross-age tutoring program where I employed students to teach each other in the school and paid them to do so. And particularly those students who were failing in a subject, I got them to teach in that subject. From that, then we moved into a 5-language newspaper that the students produced. From there into radio, students making radio programs. That from there, grade 5 students that I worked with started up, or one of the groups that started up Channel 31 here in Melbourne and were on TV and so on. So all of these were students doing real important things as part of their learning. And that became a sort of a line through. We called it student participation. We didn't use the word voice and so on. But later on, students started writing about governance issues in a number of schools where they were helping to run that school and playing a role in decision-making within that school. It's a forgotten fact that in the 80s, students were mandated to be on all secondary school councils in Victoria. Here I'm talking very Victorian-centred approach because that's where I am. That was then wiped out in the early 90s when there was a restructuring of school councils, and it wasn't that specifically that students were dumped, but they were just forgotten about. They were irrelevant because they were the government that was trying to get rid of teacher union influence and dumping teachers off school councils, not students off school councils. There are swings and roundabouts on all of this, and I remember in the late 80s that a colleague, Peter Mildenhall, wrote an article in Connect called Student Participation Wither or Wither. Where is it going, or is it withering away? And so whether there are cycles around this where things come into favour and move out of favour. So in early 90s, Roger Hart, working in Italy, developed a ladder of student participation and started looking more deeply into what do we mean by participation, and in a minimalist and maximalist view. So a minimalist view meaning participation of students bums on seats or taking part in activities. And a more maximalist view would be participation in decision-making, shared decision-making. But somewhere in the late 90s, the term student voice emerged. And I can't pin it down as to where. I do remember, and I've got some notation on this, presenting at a conference in Bangkok in 98, and then in a subsequent publication where it came up with a bit of a ladder of student voice explicitly. But part of it also might have been that Jean Ruddick at Cambridge in the UK got a big grant with a number of other researchers to look at consulting pupils about teaching and learning. It was the language of it. And when I spoke with Jean in 2002, she said she really didn't support student participation, but she supported the idea of consulting students and hearing from them. And so in many ways, the voice narrative became a watering down of that strong shared decision-making narrative. And it became one of what we need to do is just encourage students to speak up and then listen to them or not. But I mean, we take what we can get for that. And students through that period of time argued that we needed more than voice, we needed more than speaking up, because the question was, did anything happen? Did anyone listen? And did anything happen as a result of what we had to say? So I've always argued that the question is not one about student voice. it's about selective deafness of other people and whether they act in response to that. Most of the work should be done with adults about that. Some other things along the way. 1985 was International Youth Year, International Year of Youth, and there were quite a few things that spun out of that, in particular some conferences in Victoria and in other states. In New South Wales, a group in Bathurst set up the Regional Association of Student Government, and a similar group in Liverpool, and that was then jumped over in some ways, be careful about my language here, by the New South Wales Department, who set up a department-run state SRC. That lasted for 25 years and was just closed down in 2013, coincidentally after I spoke at their conference. More recently, that has now been resuscitated along the lines of the Ministerial Advisory Council. There may be someone here who can contribute more about that. Similarly, there was a group called GabFest in the Northern Territory. There was a group called SCOF, State Council of Students in South Australia. There was a group of students meeting actively around Brisbane in the southeast of Queensland. And there were attempts in the ACT and Tasmania to get groups going. And there were attempts in Victoria in the late 80s to get some form of student-run organisation going to advocate. And that really was only realised by the end of the 1990s, when a conference got together in 2001 in Ballarat and made a decision of 300 students talking for 5 days, made a decision to set up the Victorian State Students Network. And that then in turn became the Vic SRC a couple of years later and got funding. That Vic SRC becomes the only organisation in Australia of secondary school students that is autonomous or independent. It's not totally independent in the sense that it relies upon funding from various groups, but it's not embedded within a department or something like that. And so the students here can speak more about that. What else should I mention? I told you need to shut me up here, or I'll just keep going on, Adam. Other thing...
I might take that opportunity then, Roger.
Okay,
I was thinking, given the, you brought up that where it was participation and it switched to voice, we're now in a student voice symposium. I'm just interested to hear from the others what your impressions are on that distinction between student participation or student voice, and whether you think it's a relevant one now.
Yeah, I do think it's really relevant. And when I was doing my thesis and I was doing a lot of research, it's quite interesting to read what researchers are saying and when they use that different terminology and how it does. Some people use it interchangeably, some people use it meaning very different things, but I did find when you hear student voice, a lot of the research is sort of, around whether students are speaking up and in the ways in which they're doing it, and student participation is a much more sort of like inclusive and holistic thing from my personal experiences as well. So I definitely think it's an interesting distinction to make. But yeah, that's my thoughts.
Yeah, I think there is quite a lot of similarities when it comes to student voice versus student participation, but there's also that aspect of tokenistic leadership within schools and when it comes to student voice. So in my experience as a student, there's always those circumstances where, great, you've got a student who's a class captain or a sport captain, but they're doing what they want what the teacher wants them to do. So they're representing students and they're doing a great job at it, but the background and the reason for the work they're doing is because it's what the school wants them to do or what the system wants them to do. So I think that is a student and that is participating, and it's amazing and we encourage it. But I think student voice more so talks about the agency and students implementing changes and discussions about things that directly affect them rather than the school and the teachers and the system as a whole.
I'll just jump in there as well. It's actually really interesting that you brought that up, because when I was doing my research and I was looking at formal and informal student voice, and I found that informal student voice was more effective in creating change within schools that students actually wanted to see, and kind of effective student voice, I suppose. But formal student voice was more likely to lead to political activism outside of the classroom, and particularly in social movements, which I just thought was quite interesting.
Can you just explain the difference between informal and formal student voice?
Of course, sorry. So when I was looking at formal student voice, it was more sort of like structures. So talking SRCs, student leadership, any leadership roles, and then informal student voice is more that classroom and student initiated a lot of the time. And just it's more of the general atmosphere of a school or an education setting. So that's kind of the distinction that I was going off.
And if I could add in that there was, in the late 80s or 90s, there's a guy called Garth Boomer, who was Director of Curriculum in Victoria and an academic in South Australia as well. And he wrote a book called Negotiating the Curriculum. And he drew a distinction between negotiating with a small n and negotiating with a capital N. And it's very still, negotiating with a small n was what you did casually all the time, and relationships and so on. Capital N negotiation became a formal process. And I think that there's a strong parallel, Jade, with what you're talking about there.
Lynn, did you want to weigh in?
I think I definitely agree with what Jade and Sienna's already mentioned, but from my point of view, I think like student voice is often kind of the starting point when you talk about implementing student voice and agency and participatory practices in schools, because that's when you're really allowing students to actually trust the adults around them to voice their opinions and listen to them in the process. And participatory practices is when you combine agency and voice together to kind of combine that and make a holistic approach to allow this to happen.
So what I'm noticing is interesting, even though I feel like probably we're all reasonably in agreement and probably see similar in these ways. Already we're defining these terms differently, even in the chats that we're having. So, you know, Sienna, I think you made a really interesting point about participation and that it's possible to participate, but that doesn't mean you have a voice, and that tokenism could happen with that sort of participating. But I think when Jade and Lynn are talking about participation, and Roger too, they're actually talking about a different kind of thing. I think I know, looking at some of the attendees here and knowing that you're interested in this area too, one of the issues that we do have in this space is definitional. Like what do we mean when we're talking about these things? What's the difference between participation and voice, and then agency as well? So I mean, I think it's important for us to just, I don't really feel like we don't need to nail down what those things are necessarily here, but just being aware that you know, it's complex and we're talking about different things. I guess my focus is more on agency and the clear division that often made a research colleague of mine asked me the other day, what's the difference between student agency and self-directed learning? And I said a lot. And then it was sort of like, how long have you got? But the way that student agency can be used in Victoria now, it's used a lot in policy documents, a lot in schools, strategic plans and annual implementation plans. And they do more, when they're talking about agency, it is often more in regards to having access to a curriculum and knowing what they're going to be learning in 4 weeks, or being responsible for, so handing in homework would be seen as, you know, being agentic, because look at them, they've done the homework. So yeah, there's obviously a lot of flexibility of what's available there.
Jade looked as if she was about to go apoplectic and say something then.
Go for it.
Oh no, I was just going to say that, yeah, it is very interesting when you look at the government websites, and I looked at New South Wales as a program as well, and the different language that is used, and when they kind of, not to, you know, throw any shade or anything, but when they use sort of those buzz terms that are talked a lot about in this space, so agency, voice, participation, and then seeing how that manifests within schools, or rather not seeing how that manifests within school. And I think, yeah, it's quite interesting to see how it can become quite tokenistic. That's all I was going to say.
And throw it in again, Adam Fletcher in the US uses the term involvement. And he says I want meaningful student involvement. And to me, involvement had always been a lower level term. I mean, the parent groups had resisted talking about parent involvement because it meant just like raising money or doing something for the school, and they'd preferred parent participation. So that was the background through the 80s, I guess, which coloured my thinking on that. And as soon as you have to put the word meaningful in front of it, I start worrying about then who makes the decision about what is meaningful and so on.
It's interesting. I just want to tie in one of the questions we have here is that I know that Hayley Duro, who a lot of you know, who's used to be a student voice leader at her school, she visited Denmark, and she said that she would ask the students and the teachers in Denmark, but particularly the students, about student voice there, and they didn't know what she was talking about. And they didn't know what she was talking about because there were just automatic feedback processes that existed, or there was already student engagement in how schools were run, that they almost didn't need the language for it because it was just existing already, which is interesting. And I guess, Annie, to your point of what you're saying is happening in Norway, I don't know how similar or different that is to Denmark. I really feel like we're definitely today talking about the Australian context and really the Victorian context. But Annie's also just asked, are there schools in Australia that have, she said, students on curriculum committees, or are there, on different kinds of committees, I suppose. In Victoria, government schools now have to have students on school councils, so it's gone back to the 80s, as Roger just pointed out. But would any of you like to share in terms of student involvement in school governance, I suppose, and maybe specifically curriculum committees?
I think in my experience as a student, I've been in both metro and regional schools, and in none of those we've seen a curriculum committee. Students don't quite often have that specific kind of title or that specific influence in the grassroots of the school. I find in my experience, sometimes in classes, we have those teachers who are really, hey, what do you want to learn? Or would you prefer to do this or this today? It's kind of those discussions, but we don't really see those formal curriculum committees, even though that would be great. And that's definitely something that I think personally I'm going to be looking into. But just in my experience, and I know I have a lot of peers in other schools in the area, and I don't think we've seen anything quite similar to that.
Anyone else? No. Okay. I remember once when I started teaching, there were students on the curriculum committee at my school, but then they went away, and I couldn't tell you how or why.
Historically, there have been. I mean, going back, there was a course called STC back in the late 70s, early 80s, in which the entire curriculum, content, well, first of all, aims, content, pedagogy, ways of teaching, assessment and evaluation, all negotiated between teachers and students in the classroom, and that at a larger level within the school, students sat on moderating committees to defend their curriculum before other schools in the group. So that you'd go up and talk about your maths curriculum that you'd negotiated in your classroom, and people would ask questions and students would defend it. So there's been historically, but I suspect we've fallen a long way away from that now.
I think there are a couple examples that have just kind of come into my mind during my time with Vic SRC. So students on the school council was a big one. We also had the students on the selection committee for VCE books. That was something else. But aside from that, in my experience, that's pretty much it in the last couple of years.
Lynn, you've had some contact with Rosanna Primary, by the way, and again, without speaking for them, can you give us a sort of a sense of what they are doing?
Yeah, so I was just about to say, Rosanna Primary School currently revised one of their kind of programs called Deep Learning Program. And essentially one of the teachers there utilized her prep classroom to actually revise and redesign this program with them, which if we really think about it is almost unheard of. 6-year-olds like redesigning a program with their teacher that will be used for the incoming preps and up to year 6 is ahead of time, which she is actually writing an article for the new publication soon coming out, which she can expand more on that. But I just wanted to add on to everything Sienna and Jade's already said. I know that there are some schools who have students on selection hiring panels, for example, but that's not particularly curriculum based. And I personally don't know any schools that kind of have students on to help with them with curriculum. And I think a part of that is also that the Australian and Victorian curriculum as a whole, it's so rigid, there's not much room to move at times. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think another thing to think about is, I think, Jade, I don't know about you, Sienna, but Jade and Lynn and I are also from primarily the government sectors. So the degree to which in the independent sector it might be happening in ways that we're not aware of. There's a great question here from Gail, and I'll shoot this particularly to Lynn and Sienna, because I know you both are or have recently been on Vic SRC exec. If you could give examples where student voice and agency in Victoria did have influence and impact on education policy or government decisions or initiatives. So where have you guys had some wins?
Yes, I am so glad you asked this question. I saw it in the Q&A and straight away I was like, yes, I'm so excited. So one of our, sorry, my headphones are falling out. I'm smiling too big and it pushes them out. One of our most recent wins was getting a respectful relationships and consent education mandated in schools across Victoria. A lot of credit does go to so many other great students, not just the students at Vic SRC. There was a really influential young woman in Geelong who spoke about her experience with sexual assault and how she thinks that learning a proper consent education curriculum could actually improve the way men treat women or everyone treats everyone else. And that was something that Vic SRC took up. We have Congress, which is our Flagstaff leadership event. So once a year, students across Victoria come together and they share their priorities on the biggest issues they think are affecting them and the education system. And for the past so many years, consent education and respectful relationships have always been that kind of one alongside mental health that has been continuously stated as a really big issue and a really large gap in our learning. And Vic SRC did a lot of great work, a lot of great advocacy work. They did so much partnership with other organizations and other students. And because of that, consent education has now been mandated in schools across Victoria, which is really exciting. Lynn, did you want to add anything to that one?
Yes, and also for the last 2 years, both Sienna and I sat on the mental health reform reference group for schools, so we were able to represent student voice in the meetings to help develop the school's mental health fund menu. So we were really able to discuss with experts in the field of mental health and across sectors to make this as student focused as possible.
Yeah, cool. Roger or Jade, are there any successes you know of you'd like to throw in there? Or
I think the ones I mentioned before about having students on school council and also on the selection committee for books are two other really great examples that come to mind.
And I think those can't be underestimated. They're really important ones because the department had run inquiries into the representation of students on school councils before in the late 2000s and had decided not to. And to turn the minister and the department round on that issue, I think was a major win for the advocacy work of the Vic SRC. The other one, larger one, is the Teach the Teacher program. And that, I think, coming in as being like, oh, wouldn't it be nice if in 2011, where some students wrote a program about how they could run professional development for teachers in the school, and to see that then picked up and funded across the state for the Vic SRC to run it, not for the department to run it, but for the Vic SRC to run it, but with funding from the government, and also for it to be recognised internationally out of the Finnish 500, was it, I think, program, was really heartening that was turning around the relationships, that students can be seen as experts in the school who are able to work with teachers in partnership, but in a leadership role with teachers to actually change practices.
I think it's also just worth mentioning when it comes to education policy and government. I think we have been lucky in recent years in Victoria, because we did have an education minister, James Merlino, who is very supportive of student voice, and as a consequence of that, in government schools in Victoria, there's FISO 2.0, which is the framework for improving student outcomes, which now has a student wellbeing focus, and a student voice and agency is part of that. And one of the things I noticed, I had a role last year where I was visiting schools all around Victoria, and the number of schools that had student voice and agency as part of their strategic plans was definitely the majority of them. Now, the degree to which they were implementing this tokenistically or otherwise is definitely up for discussion, but it was there and it was part of school policy. And the reason it was part of school policy was because clearly on a state level, it was being prioritised. So I think watch this space too, because a lot of schools currently are trying to implement these practices. Maybe I might ask a bit of a self-interested question then, because as a consequence of that, there have been applications, so apps, and which are student survey apps or similar, which schools where they're not very well equipped to know what to do about student voice and agency, hear from their principal friend in another school, oh, well, we just got this app, get this app, students will do it. They fill in a survey, there you go, student voice, tick. I was just wondering if maybe the students here had anything to share about sort of how you might suggest implementing student voice in schools in, dare I say, Roger, a meaningful way.
Yeah, I've heard a lot about those apps. I've used some surveys and things, but the apps, I think it kind of comes back to this idea of the voice needs to be listened to. And I think these apps have incredible potential and they collect really great data. They're accessible for a lot of people. It's a nice way, like an easy way for students and iGen to kind of, give feedback. But yeah, at the end of the day, I think it needs to be listened to. And I also think that when you kind of have that by itself, it isolates where students can voice their opinions. And I think what really needs to happen is it needs to be all the time throughout the whole education system and the atmosphere of the schools I spoke earlier. And that, from my research, is really the most effective way to have positive change from students.
Yeah, and just adding on, I do agree that these can have so much potential, but at the end of the day, it is simply quantitative data. And I think that these apps in itself would be a great stepping point for schools to gauge how students are feeling about student voice. But the next step would also be to formally meet with and talk with as many students as possible and actively work with them to kind of create this atmosphere of trust where they can voice their opinions and experiences more freely without having to remain anonymous or click a button at schools.
Yeah, definitely. I wholeheartedly agree with everything Lynn and Jade just said. And I really wanted to highlight a comment Jade made about the apps isolating, where students can, inform like other people of their student voice and initiatives that they think are really important, because it does kind of have that effect. If you feel like you have this one app or this one space where that is all you can do with it, it kind of defeats the purpose of student voice, especially because everything around students is always changing, whether that's our social life, things we see on social media, whether it's experiences that we've had in the classroom with the curriculum, or the way we've interpreted a piece of work that we've learned about. So having that space constantly available for students, whether that's having a teacher that puts their hand up, hey, if you have an idea, email me anytime. I might reply only during school hours, but you still have that space to email me. Or, hey, you know where my office is, come have a chat. It doesn't always have to be that formal setting of, we're doing student voice, everyone get excited, it's student voice. Like, it can just simply be a conversation, because I can't reiterate how important it is that so many great advocacy points simply just start with a conversation.
And I think also it really comes, just to add on, down to relationships. And I think it's something we often kind of skip over when we in this area, but it is so integral. And that student to teacher relationship is honestly, it's kind of the foundation of a lot of really positive student voice and change that happens within schools. And I mean, from my own experiences, I went to Fitzroy High School, which like we have a big focus on teacher-student relationships, and my experiences there going from Melbourne Girls College to Fitzroy were very different, and that atmosphere that I experienced at Fitzroy enabled me to really use my voice and see the change immediately, and that was something really great. And it came from the fact that I felt like my teachers respected me and listened to my opinion, and I had those relationships with them. And I mean, like, even just one example, I was in history class and my favorite teacher, actually, she was like, oh, we're gonna do it was like a mind map, but it was like in these puzzle pieces or whatever. And I just kind of looked at her and I was like, really? And she was like, well, Jade, what would you like to do? And I was like, can I just take notes like I normally do? And she was like, yeah. And I was like, sweet. And that's, you know, and it's funny to me that that is an example of student voice, because it seems so small, but going from Melbourne Girls College, where that wouldn't have been an option, and the amount of times where I had to sit there and do mind maps when I hate mind maps was a lot of the time. So like, even that small thing, and that you can already tell that the foundation of that interaction was that relationship that I had with her, and everybody in the classroom had that relationship with her and with all of the teachers. So I think that's something, yeah, quite profound, that we, like, you know, watch this space, honestly, because relationships is kind of where it's at.
And the other aspect of that too is, from a teacher's point of view, is that one needs to be intentionally a teacher through those things, in the sense of thinking, can I get students, or encourage or ask or support students to do it rather than me doing it as a teacher? So seeing that as an educational process. So can I step away? Can I be invisible? The best class I ever saw was in the Southern Appalachian Mountains in deep South USA, where the teacher was talking to us about the program they ran, and I didn't see him do an instructional thing all class with the students. The students just knew how to run that entire class by themselves, collaboratively within the class. And obviously he was maybe raising an eyebrow here or there, but he was in that position where he trusted the students, but also had expectations that they would be the centre and the leaders within it, rather than him in that case.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the most beautiful experiences as a student, when you have classes where you can do that and you're allowed to do that. But yeah, I think and that again, it just comes down to relationships. So I think that's, yeah, it's a really integral point, and sort of key aspect of student voice that we need to look into more.
Yeah, I think when we talk about student voice and student agency especially, we put so much emphasis on the student having to do all the work and all the advocacy, when leadership teams and teachers, they have such a large role in this, because student agency can really only be achieved through that mutually supportive relationship with teachers, as well as community as well. But teachers play such a key role in creating a culture and learning environment that values the student agency and voice like practices. So I think reframing that traditional teacher role as like the authoritative figure where they're delivering instructions in the classroom, to shifting it to a mentor where learning and curriculum can be co-created, will really allow student agency to increase, because that student teacher dynamic then becomes a partnership, and that will really allow students to, first of all, trust and listen to their teachers, but also really take active action in organizing their own learning, and also develop like a sense of inherent purpose in their education. Like, they're not just sitting in a classroom listening to someone talk at them, they're actively participating in their own learning. And I think only then will student voice achieve parity, because when that dynamic shifts in the process, then they'll feel safe enough to. And also, learning's dynamic. You do need to change it depending on each student. So yeah.
Do you think students have the power to introduce something? I mean, I'm thinking back to the time that I introduced that cross-age tutoring program. Now, I didn't ask students whether we should have a cross-age tutoring program. mean, they had the choice of whether they wanted to join or what they wanted to tutor and how they wanted to tutor within it, with support from me. But I never asked them whether that was very much me as a teacher initiating that.
But sometimes I think teachers do need to give a little push, a little shove, because sometimes I think a lot of the times when students are told, no, you cannot do this, you have to follow instructions, this is the way the system works and is structured, it kind of just becomes a baseline belief and you think that's how it's always going to be, until someone shows you that there is change and something can happen. Then they'll be able to kind of open up and come out of their shell a little more and be like, okay, this is what I want to do.
Lynn, I think you make a really good point, but I have a bit of a different perspective on that. I think that in a lot of the schools that we see, there's no space for students to really take initiative because there isn't that atmosphere that allows them the space. And I think from my experience, especially at Fitzroy, there was that space and there was that atmosphere and students really took that on. And I actually found when we moved campuses, we established a new campus and we decided to establish a formal student leadership committee, and that had never been done at my school before, and it was organized by a teacher, and I felt like there was less change and it became very tokenistic with that push. But yeah, ironically, when it was just natural and it was happening, so many things were going on and people were really taking initiative, and I think it was because there was that space within that education system that allowed for students and that general atmosphere. And as I said before, those relationships where students really were the biggest stakeholders in their education. And I think when you have a school that kind of has that as the foundation, it has some really incredible effects. And so I think and especially like from what I've read in the research, it's informal student voice is the most effective way to have student voice that makes change within a school. And so I think that's where it's at. That's my perspective there. And I mean, that's a whole school atmosphere shift as well. And I think also a whole education system shift as well. So we're a little bit far away from that, but
we'll get there one day, hopefully.
I think sort of building on that and to your point, I mean, where you guys are almost talking about, I think you said, Lynn, the inherent worth of education, working with teachers last year, and even a teacher was saying this to me a couple of days ago, schools right now are actually just finding it very difficult to get students to follow the rules. And that's across sectors, like independent, Catholic, government, anywhere, that students just sort of aren't putting up with schools that much right now. And that's pretty systemic. And I think the things that you're talking about now and suggesting really offer to schools and teachers and the system at large, maybe ways that they can get their students to think that it's a nice idea to turn up to school. But even just last week, a teacher, I proposed this to a teacher friend of mine, and they said, yeah, but I don't have time for that. I don't have time to work that out. I also think, Jade, this point about relationships too, and just to bring it back to which my question was about these apps and using these apps across schools. I know as well that to wear my teacher hat, a lot of teachers are very reluctant about these student surveys because they see them as an accountability mechanism or surveillance of teachers. And actually a lot of schools are using these surveys in that way too. And then if that's how they're being used, then really that's going to be undermining all of the important relationships that you've all emphasized are so important.
It's the intention of them, so that you only, I mean, data is not useful except if you have an intention to use it and if you know why you're going to use that. So people who want to use it for surveillance will use that data to check up on teachers or to check up on students. But where it was useful in the early days of getting the student attitudes to schools survey was that it scared a number of schools when they got results which were crunched together and given back to them that showed a deterioration in relationships, let's say, or learning and things like that. The best